Last time I was here, I spoke about needs assessment and the entire process that you go through to conduct those large-scale three-phase needs assessment. You can go back to that material. There's also the toolkit on my website. And in the next few months, there will be an entire online course on conducting needs assessment and program evaluation. So look out for those in 2022. Today, I'm going to focus strictly on outcome evaluation with respect to impact evaluation. In this one, I'll focus more on using agricultural examples, but the logic behind it remains the same, whether it's youth programs, it's home and community agriculture. The idea of connecting short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes always remain the same because in extension, we typically follow that linear evaluation process. So just going over what we'll talk about today, I'll start with identifying needs, critical issues, and programming gaps. Then I'll move on to long-term outcomes, specifically economic and environmental outcomes. And then backwards again to developing medium-term adoption outcomes. This would be followed by identifying relevant short-term outcomes. And the short-term outcomes part of this is most important because it's always the information that we can gather directly from our participants. So it's important that we collect the right data from them. And then at the end, I'll make that connection between short, medium, and long-term outcomes. And I'll go a step further and connect that to needs, critical issues, and solutions. So this is going to start at a very broad level where we're going to talk about the idea of critical issues, and then we'll work our way backwards. You'd realize that in a logic model or any sort of program planning and evaluation, we always work backwards. We start with that big idea, and then we connect that to some long-term outcomes, and then we create medium and short-term outcomes. And at that point, then we start talking about program activities. So at the end of this entire presentation, you should be able to create an evaluation plan that focuses on the most relevant outcomes. So any program that we create in extension, it doesn't matter program area, any program must relate to some sort of problem or need. The idea is that whatever we create should be targeted at improving some sort of condition or solving some known problem. That's the whole point of extension, to improve people's life, to solve societal problems. And this is important to identify before we even start with the evaluation, because the evaluation shows us how we went ahead to solve that problem. And one of the first things I always talk about is that needs assessment. The needs assessment basically gives us what are those problems, what are those societal conditions that needs improving. And based on that, we create a program to target those problems. And the long-term outcomes, as you would see when, as we move on, the long-term outcomes is always related to the solution to that problem. So we always start by asking what are the most important problems and how can extension programs improve that condition. And both the program plan and the evaluation plan starts with that need and starts with a long-term outcome, which is ideally the solution to that problem or how we can improve our exam condition. And it's good to know that when we create those needs assessment, we focus on coming up with causes and solutions, because those are the two things that would help us frame that broad need. So if you look at my statewide needs assessment, you would see there are priority needs, there are critical issues, and those items are very broad in nature. So I think the highest ranking critical issue was water quality and quantity. That in itself is so broad that it's up to us to decide, okay, what dimension of that need we're going to target through our programming. So always start at the broad level and then start thinking about problems, solutions, causes, consequences, all those things that are tied to that overall area. So the needs assessment was designed that way so that everyone can try to craft the program plan or evaluation plan by using those items and finding dimension that most closely associates with what they're doing. So let's say we use an example of protecting water quality and quantity. There are so much different dimensions to that. If we take one part of it, we can say, okay, some of the possible causes could be water overuse. It could be depleted aquifers and those things that reduce water quantity. That's just one part of this big, broad problem. Then at that point, we start thinking about solutions. What can we do through our programming to address those problems? So that's why we move down from broad needs to identify cause to exploring solutions, because those solutions that we come up with would be the main target or the main aim of the program. And in turn, those would be our long-term outcomes. And once we identify what are those solutions and explore what are the most practical way of addressing that problem, then we can work our way backwards to creating medium-term and short-term outcomes. So once we have that long-term outcome, which is the solution, then we can work backwards. And that's the start of creating that outcome evaluation plan. So this is a snapshot of the needs assessment that was conducted in 2019, but I also wanted to highlight the assessment that was conducted in 2021. Andrea Walker-Bravo and I conducted a needs assessment by asking basically county commissioners what are their perception of the important issues extension should address. And on the right, these are the top 10 issues that were identified by elected officials. And on the left, it's the critical issues that was identified in the 2019 needs assessment. So in both cases, broad ideas, broad issues that you can now take a closer look at each one, identify causes, identify solutions, identify consequences if this problem is not addressed. And those are the things that would start to give you those long-term outcomes. There are some similarities between these two assessments. We can see that water quality and water quantity was two of the biggest things across both population. The elected officials identify mostly issues related to agriculture and natural resources, while on the residents side, they highlighted things like air quality, but they also identify major agricultural issues like agricultural farmland and local food systems. So in both cases, agriculture was ranked high in both populations. So these are good resources that you can use to create your programs. Now, at the county level, if you decide to create your own program that targets the specific needs of your county, then I encourage you to work as a team at the county level and create those assessments, because that would give you very tailored information to identify the most relevant issues affecting your population. So in this case, your population for your needs assessment could be farmers or ranchers or anybody within agriculture, if that's the target for your programming. So it's important that you create those county level assessments with your target population, because both these assessments did not have agricultural producers as the target population. Okay, so let's start at the broadest level, creating those long-term outcomes. As I said, it comes from solutions to those problems, and those problems arise because of the needs that we identify in the beginning. Solutions in itself are those things that we aspire to do. That's the whole point of creating our programs. That's the big thing that we want to address. So ideally, those are long-term outcomes, but we must ensure that those solutions are directly aligned to whatever the problem was or whatever the need was. Because then we can make that statement that if we solve this issue, then this issue relates to that need. So we tailor problem statement to that need and tailor that solution to ensure that our program is relevant. And within this problem statement, I'm sure all of us are familiar with writing a problem statement. We start with writing the current condition, which is what are the issues, and then identifying the desired condition. And the gap between those two things is the need. So the solution would ideally close that gap between the current and the desired solution. In agriculture, we mostly focus on two types of long-term outcomes. Those are the economic factor of it and the environmental factor. The economic factor deals with agricultural productivity, and that relates to mainly profit maximization and efficiency in labor and capital. Those are the two things that we can always tie back our long-term outcomes to. So we can improve profitability, we can reduce cost, we can increase efficiency. And all those things should be in any long-term outcome of agricultural program plan. The other part of it, which is a much more broader and more nuanced factor, is the environmental issue. This can mostly relate to the sustainable use of natural resources. So I'll show how these two things can be connected, but in our evaluation plan, our outcome evaluation plan, at least one of these two things should be a long-term outcome. So this is just an example of how we can get different long-term outcomes from the same need or issue. So let's start with the broad area, which was water quantity, water quality. And then from that, we identify one of the main problems is depleted aquifers. That mainly relates to water quantity. And we can see that the obvious and most immediate solution to that problem, which is our major long-term outcome, is efficient water use. So that in itself is still broad, right? But it gives a solution. So it is in our long-term outcomes. But if we do address that, let's start at the top. Efficient water use. How can we ensure efficient water use? It's a matter of reducing water consumption. So that could result in reduced in cost and inputs in the long run, because we're using less resources. At the same time, we're ensuring that we save our water resources. So it could result in sustainable water use, which is the environmental factor. So you can see that this one problem, this main need provided three different long-term outcomes. And when we're thinking about long-term outcomes, it's always good to think about it in a broad manner, but also make sure that it's all connected. So the overarching problem here can be connected to our environmental aspect and the economic aspect, which is always present in a program plan in agriculture, in a program plan and the evaluation plan. So thinking about that big, broad aspect, in evaluation, it's typically very difficult to gather data on long-term outcomes. And even if we do collect that data, it's difficult to connect our program to that. We can't establish that cause and effect so easily, because we don't conduct experimental studies in evaluation because it's difficult to collect that type of data. So what we can do is collect medium-term outcomes. And if we collect medium-term outcomes, then that should be enough for us to make an assumption about long-term outcomes. So at this point is where we start creating the observable evaluation, what we can directly collect from participants. And at this point, we need to make sure we collect the right information to make those assumptions. So medium-term outcome across the board, regardless of program areas, are always based on adoption, changes in behavior, policy changes, implementation, all those different things that involve some sort of change. And in agriculture, it's mostly related to adoption of new technology, adoption of a new practice, adoption of something different. And if we think about our long-term outcome, then we can always consider what are the things that our participants need to do to ensure those solutions, those long-term outcomes. What needs to happen before we realize the long-term outcomes? So it's always connected directly to the solution. In this case, we're basically thinking what we're going to ask our participants to do. All our program activities are geared towards doing something different, making sure that our participants leave our program trying something different, adopting a new technology, or doing something that they're not currently doing. And in that case, we need to ensure that whatever we're asking them to do or change connects to the solution. But we also need to think about how practical it is for them to adopt that behavior, because that would affect adoption rates. Then we have to consider the timeline. I always get the question of when should I collect medium-term outcome data? That specifically relates to what you're asking them to do. Some things could be 2 months, something could be 6 months, medium term could even be 1 year, because it's all about what you're asking them to do, how difficult it is to do, what are the barriers to it, and how practical it is. So all those things affect the timeline of that medium-term outcome, like data collection. It's good to think about those small things, those small adoption factors that have the lowest barriers to do, are the most practical and can be adopted quickly. So if we do incremental programs and we're asking people to change simple behaviors, then we're more likely to see an increase in adoption rates. And collecting medium-term outcome data, it's very brief data. It's not like an exit survey where you have a whole questionnaire or you do a focus group after the end of a activity. Medium-term outcome specifically relates to the number of people that change a behavior. So you don't need to ask 20 questions to get that. Most of my medium-term outcome evaluation plans has about 4 questions at most in that follow-up survey. It's simply a matter of getting the number of people who change a behavior. So just connecting that medium term to the long term, I said that the medium term outcome is directly observable. We can collect that data by just following up with our participants. The issue is that we cannot, most of the time, collect long-term data. Long-term data, especially in agriculture, is over 1 year, because a lot of the things that needs to change, you need to have sustained or continued adoption before they see changes in profitability, before they see changes in cost, and all those things. So it takes time. So we need to make sure that whatever we collect at the medium term is enough for us to make that assumption about long-term outcomes. So we need to be able to confidently say that if participants do this, then this will happen. And that is ideally the solution. So if we change our behavior in one particular way, then the solution would occur. We would realize the solution. So looking at our previous example, if we're asking farmers to adopt smart irrigation technologies, that's the medium-term outcomes. That could be through some sort of best management practices. At that point, we should be able to make the connection that if farmers adopt smart irrigation technologies, and again, this could be specific to what type of technology you're asking them to do. If they do adopt this in the medium term, then we could assume that it would lead to efficient water use. If there is efficiency in water use, then we can also assume a reduction in inputs, which would lead to a reduction in the cost. And at the same time, if they continue this adoption, and this happens over the long run, then we could make the assumption of sustainable water use, and goes back to the big problem of water quantity. So we make that entire connection simply by collecting medium-term outcome. If we do collect long-term outcome, the issue is external validity. it's difficult for us to say that our program resulted in this. And if our program didn't exist, then this won't happen. That's the difficult part of making that long-term connection. So it's always done with some broad assumptions, but we must have at least some data there to make the link and the assumption. So when we talk about impact, we always talk about impact with some limitations because we don't have that data to actually show or provide the evidence that X leads to this, or like X leads to Y, or like what we're doing results in this. And if we do make that statement, then it's easy for someone to ask, how can you prove that connection? So medium-term outcome, you can collect that data. It's a matter of asking people simply, did you adopt this technology? Did you change this behavior? Did you do this new practice? And at that point, if you collect the right data, you can make the assumption. So it's observable, and it's the main indicator we use to establish program impact, especially in evaluation. Now, this is what I would call directly in our control. We can collect this data from our participants because we have a captive audience. If you conduct a training, if you conduct a webinar, if you do any sort of thing where you interact with participants, you can collect data from them. It doesn't need to be surveys. It can be focus groups. It can be interviews. It can be key informant interviews. All those different things you can do to collect data, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods. But the important thing is that you have that captive audience. You are interacting with these people. So it's important that we do our best to collect short-term outcomes. And the good thing about this is if we collect the right short-term outcomes, then we can even make an assumption about medium-term and long-term outcomes. You'd realize that I'm using the word assumption a lot because I work with the premise that it's always difficult to gather follow-up data from participants. Response rates for medium-term outcome would usually be around 20%, if so much. For long-term, it's about 5%. So if you know that your response rate is going to fall off dramatically if you're collecting follow-up surveys, then it's important that you do your best to get 100% response rate for your short-term outcomes, which is ideally your pre-test, your post-test, your exit survey, whatever it is you're using to collect that short-term outcome. And what's even more important is that you ask the right questions. So it's always about what leads to adoption. What are the things that needs to happen cognitively that would lead to adoption? What are the barriers? What knowledge is needed? What skill is needed? What attitude change is needed? All those things are what we need to collect to measure the likelihood of adoption. So when you're thinking about your short-term outcomes, always ask the question, what should happen before people adopt a practice? What are those big things that we need to do to make that change? And you would soon realize that if you do a pre-test and post-test, knowledge change in itself doesn't guarantee adoption. If I know about something, or if I'm knowledgeable about something, it doesn't mean that I'm going to do it. There could be so much different barriers that prevents me from doing it. And even though I have the knowledge, I just can't. So there are so much different things we need to consider. Always think about what needs to happen before adoption occurs. And an effective program is one that ensures adoption. If we can't collect medium-term adoption rates, if we can't collect medium-term data, then we need to ensure that for us to say that we had an effective program, we should be able to estimate the likelihood of adoption. And the likelihood of adoption is based on those short-term outcomes. What occurred in participants directly after attending your program or taking part in your program. Impact only occurs when medium-term outcomes are realized. When people adopt something, then we go on to talk about impacts. Outcomes specifically relates to short-term and medium-term outcomes. Long-term outcome in itself, it's at that point where we can make claims about impact. So if we can't collect follow-up data from medium-term and long-term, and we don't collect the right information, the right data from short-term outcomes, then it's very difficult to claim impact because we don't have the necessary data. So short-term outcomes is that the easiest point of access, and we need to make sure we get that right. Knowledge alone is not enough to predict impact, to predict adoption, and then to make assumption of impact. So when we're thinking about short-term outcomes, always think about what are the favorable conditions for adoption, what needs to happen before people change their behavior. And those would be the antecedents or the prerequisites of adoption. So let's look at it in a linear way. Have program activities. We understand what we want our participants to do, that short-term outcomes connect those two things. What needs to happen before adoption? And you would realize that at this point, we're only talking about the direct changes in participants. And that is the connection between program activities and eventual program impact. So if we collect the right short-term data, then we can make those assumptions. So it's always good to think about the most relevant indicators. The idea is to keep the instrument as short as possible, make sure participants can complete all these surveys or interviews or focus groups without any barriers. It should be as easy as possible for participants. So always think about this when you're creating data collection instruments. What can I do to make sure this is as easy as possible? Can I integrate my surveys into the program itself? Can I have checks throughout a training? Anything that you can do to collect the information as easy as possible, then do that. Keeps surveys as short as possible. Exit survey shouldn't take a participant more than 5 minutes to complete. And the only way to do this is to make sure we ask the right questions without having a lot of irrelevant questions in there. So we should always consider what are the most important questions we need to ask, and how do these questions connect to the medium-term and the long-term outcomes. So one of the things that we use a lot in evaluation is use changed theories to connect short-term and medium-term outcomes. What are those factors of change? What predicts change? What are the most important things that needs to happen before change occurs? And change being that medium-term outcome. Behavior change theories, there's a lot of them out there that can help you craft those short-term outcomes. The most common theory of planned behavior, there's a lot of learning theories, adult learning, all those different things. One of the theories that are most popular in agricultural extension is the diffusion of innovations. So I will just go over this brief and show how it connects to medium-term and long-term outcomes. So the diffusion of innovations is basically a communication theory that looks at how people adopt a technology over time, how it is communicated, how it works through a social system. If you introduce a new technology to some social system, how is that technology adopted over time? And it's the same idea for our programs. If we implement our program, how does this program lead to adoption? And again, adoption connects to the long term. So when we're looking at those things that are most likely to predict adoption, the theory basically gives us the most relevant indicators. You can use behavior change theories to estimate the percent likelihood that someone would adopt a smart irrigation technology, but we need to have that data in the first place. The fusion of innovations, as just an example theory, tells us that there are 5 attributes of an innovation that predicts adoption. If we know these are the attributes that predicts adoption, then these are the things that we should be evaluating in the short term. These are the short-term outcomes we should be using. So one of the most important things is relative advantage. Is this technology or this practice better than what already exists? So if you're asking them to do something that they think are not as good as what they're doing right now, chances are they're simply not going to adopt it, right? Another one is compatibility. In agriculture, this is very, very important, because if you're asking them to change a behavior and it requires that they change a lot of things in their system, then it makes it more difficult for them to adopt. Even though they have the knowledge to know how to do it, they think it's better than what they're already doing, but because they need to change so much different things in their production system, they simply can't adopt it. So they need to see that whatever it is you're asking them to do is consistent or compatible with what they already have, the system that's already in place. And this relates back to that idea of asking them to do something practical and the barriers to doing it. Another aspect is complexity, how difficult it is to adopt it. How is it easy to understand? It is simple to use, all those different things. So this is the only factor here that relates to knowledge. And knowledge is only one part of complexity. Another one is trialability. Can they experiment with it on a short-term basis before committing to it? And then you have observability. Can they see the benefits of it? So all of these things need to happen before a producer says, okay, I'm going to implement this practice on farm. I'm going to implement this technology. I'm going to change what I'm doing right now to do this new thing or to do this thing different because you're asking me to do this. And if these things, if they perceive that, if they think that these things are not there, if they think it's not better than what they're doing, if they think it's not compatible with what they're doing, if they think it's difficult to use and they can't see the benefits of it, then the likelihood of adoption is very, very low. So at the end of our program, if we can gather participants' perception towards these things, then we have decent short-term outcome data to predict adoption and then make that assumption about long-term outcomes. So this is just an example of what are the subcomponents of each attribute of the innovation. These could be part of your short-term outcome indicators. So things like relative advantage, we talk about reduced risk and lower cost. That's basically their perception of how risky something is to do. If it would result in a lower cost, what are the benefits of doing something? You have compatibility, meaning that it fit with what they already already doing. If there need to be any changes in the current infrastructure, those are important things. You have complexity, trialability, observability. You would notice that knowledge is only one subcomponent of this entire equation. Knowledge data alone does not give you impact. It does not tell you how effective your program is. It only tells you if participants learned something. If participants learn something, let's say there's a statistically significant difference between pre and post test. All that tells you is that participants had a change in knowledge, a statistical change in knowledge. It doesn't give you enough information to make an assumption about adoption. As I said, we can know how to do something. We can know how to adopt a smart irrigation technology. We can understand how to do all these different things, but that does not mean we're going to do it. There are so much different barriers, so much different things we need to consider before that happens. So having that knowledge data point alone, it's not enough to predict adoption. If we can't predict adoption, then we can't make an assumption about long-term outcomes. And then we can't make an assumption about impact. So this is just a connection of how it all flows. At the starting with program activities, whatever we do, let's say we do a series of trainings, face-to-face trainings. At the end of those trainings, let's say you have a group of farmers attending every single one of those trainings. At the end of that, they should leave that with positive perceptions about relative advantage, compatibility, complexity, trialability, and observability with respect to that innovation, with respect to that technology, because you're asking them to change something or adopt something. So when they leave this training series, they think all these different prerequisites of adoption or the attributes of an innovation is favorable. Then with that data alone at the short term, you can get that through an exit survey. You can say that there is a 90% likelihood that participants would adopt this practice. Moving on to medium term in adoption, let's say it's 6 months after, because some of these things take time. 6 months after you send out your medium term follow-up survey and you get back a 5% response rate. Then you don't have enough data to say the number of people that adopted. You can't generalize from 5% of your population. But then you still have your short-term data where everyone answered. So you can still use that without having to resort to that 5% response rate survey, because you collected the right information at the exit survey. And then you can use that to make those assumptions. If the follow-up survey goes well and you have a decent response rate, then you can use both the short-term data and the medium-term data to make the assumptions about impact. All it does is strengthen your case about impact. You have more data to show or to assume that long-term outcome, and which is always, it solves the problem. It relates to those direct things that connects to the need. So this is just an example of how our exit survey would look if we use the attributes of an innovation in the diffusion of innovations. I can send this to you all after. So this is just a snapshot of how it comes together. It's basically asking people their level of agreement on these items. This is just a brief example of what it looks like. There's different things that we can ask, and we should always tailor these instruments to whatever we're asking people to do. So it's not like we can use this as is. We should always tailor our instrument to the program. So looking at the entire process now from when I started, I just wanted to show how all these things connect. And I started with that need. I didn't talk about program activities or trainings or anything like that until way down in the end, because those are the things we think about after we figure out what was the need, what was the problem, what was the long-term outcome, what is the solution, and then what needs to happen. So our activities in itself should be created based on what we're asking people to do, based on what our solutions are and what the problem is. So that's why evaluation and program planning goes hand in hand, because in the program plan, you create long-term outcomes. You create program objectives. That's essentially your long-term outcomes. And you do all that before proposing activities. You don't ever start a program saying, okay, I want to do a training on X, Y, and Z. The question is always, why should we do this training? So you always start at the need, then work your way down to, if you have a need, you can identify causes, consequence, solutions. If you identify causes and consequence, you can identify solutions. Then you can work your way down to adoption. What do we need to do to ensure the solution? What do we need to do to make that change? And then you can work your way down to outcomes, to short-term outcomes. So what the participants need to change in order to guarantee adoption, what needs to happen before adoption occurs. So it's always that need, problem, long-term outcome, medium term, and then short term. And as I said, the combination of short-term outcomes and medium-term outcomes only relate to program outcomes, not impact. Impact occurs at the long term. So if we collect that data at short and medium term, then we can make that assumption about impact. Okay, so I'm sure many of you all are familiar with outcomes and impact quarterly. We launched that in 2021 in January, and we're on the 4th issue of the first volume. We got a lot of submissions over the last 4 issues, and the next call for submissions would be in January. We created this with the idea that you can have an avenue to submit your evaluation. You can always use this outlet to communicate the impacts of your program, the outcomes of your program. And the good thing about it is that we send this out to county commissioners, to elected officials, internally, externally. We send out an electronic newsletter. We send out a printed newsletter to all the county offices, and we also publish this online. So you get a DOI number, and plus you can track this online. You can track your downloads, you can track who is accessing your work. And this entire publication shows the outcomes of extension programming. So if you conduct your evaluation, regardless of what evaluation it is, what program it is, if you conduct your evaluation and you get findings, you can submit it to this, and we would send it out. And this is quarterly. So whenever you conduct your evaluation, always consider that you can submit it in outcomes and impact quarterly. And we take submissions year round. So with that, I would like to thank you all for listening, and